Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're plunging headfirst into a situation that, honestly, sounds like it's ripped straight from a geopolitical thriller.
Yeah.
Brazil versus Global Magnitsky.
Yeah, it really does.
And in many ways it is. We're talking about Brazil, a major global player, contemplating defiance of U.S. sanctions. I mean, that's a move that could fundamentally reshape its future, its economy, its whole place on the global stage.
Absolutely. The stakes are incredibly high.
So our mission today is clear. We want to cut through all the noise, all the headlines. We've gathered a stack of sources, articles, research, our own notes, and we're going to try and give you a clear, actionable understanding of what defying U.S. sanctions really means for Brazil. We'll be digging into the Global Magnitsky Act itself, what it actually does, looking at the key players involved, and there are quite a few, and mapping out the high-stakes implications for the Brazilian economy and, importantly, for its citizens. Think of this as your shortcut, maybe, to understanding this complex dance between national sovereignty and, well, the realities in the global financial system.
It's a fascinating dynamic.
Exactly. So, why does this matter to you listening right now? Well, whether you're tracking global markets or maybe you're interested in international law, or perhaps you're just curious about how power really works in our interconnected world. This deep dive should give you those crucial insights. You'd hopefully walk away not just informed, but with a deeper understanding of the intricate mechanisms that truly move nations.
And what's truly fascinating here, I think, is observing how a targeted sanction, initially aimed at just one single high-profile Brazilian official, can so quickly escalate.
Right.
It blows up into this macro policy dispute. Suddenly, it's not just about one person anymore. It's forcing a country as significant as Brazil to confront these fundamental questions about its sovereignty and its economic vulnerability on a grand scale. The way Brazil's institutions reacted right at the beginning, that immediate and robust response, it really set the stage for this core dilemma. It showed this was going to be far more than just a minor incident.
Okay, so let's start there. Let's build the foundation. #tag1. Brief overview. What exactly is the Global Magnitsky framework? Can we unpack that in simple terms?
Sure. So basically, it's a powerful tool the U.S. government uses for targeted sanctions. It's not like sanctioning a whole country right off the bat. It's designed to go after specific foreign individuals and its companies, too, that are believed to be involved in serious human rights abuses or significant acts of corruption.
So hitting specific bad actors, not the whole population.
That's the idea, yeah. Hit them where it hurts most. Their finances, their ability to travel, without necessarily imposing those broad countrywide sanctions, at least initially.
Okay, so how does it actually work? What are the mechanics?
Right. So when someone gets designated under Global Magnitsky, a few key things happen almost immediately. First, any assets they hold that fall under U.S. jurisdiction, think bank accounts in the U.S., property, stocks held through U.S. brokers, they're frozen instantly.
Frozen meaning?
Meaning no transactions allowed involving those assets. They can't access them, move them, sell them, nothing. Second, there's this critical U.S. person rule.
Okay.
This means anyone physically within the U.S. or any U.S. company, and this is key, including their foreign branches, is legally bound to comply. They are explicitly prohibited from dealing with the sanctioned individual or entity. No business deals, no services, nothing.
Okay, so U.S. citizens, U.S. companies everywhere, but what about, say, a Brazilian bank or a European one? Do they have to follow these rules?
This is where it gets interesting. This is where the contagion by caution comes into play.
Contagion by caution. Sounds ominous.
It kind of is, financially speaking. So even non-U.S. banks, which aren't directly under U.S. law for this purpose, they often choose to align with these sanctions anyway.
Why?
Pure pragmatism. They need to protect their crucial dollar clearing and correspondent relationships with U.S. financial institutions. Losing access to the U.S. dollar system, that's like an existential threat for any major global bank. So they tend to err on the side of extreme caution.
So they cut ties to avoid getting into trouble themselves.
Exactly. Plus, there's another layer, the material support risk. If you knowingly help a sanctioned person, whether that's through financing, providing services, any kind of support, you yourself can become sanctionable under the same authority. It's designed to cast a really broad net to isolate the target.
I often think of it like a global financial no-fly list for individuals.
That's a good analogy.
Once you're on it, you can't touch anything that flies through U.S. airspace, financially speaking. And because every other airline, or in this case, global bank, wants to keep flying smoothly without any issues, many of them will also refuse you service. even if they're not strictly legally required to by their laws. They just do it to avoid any trouble or risk to their own operations.
Mm.
It's such a powerful deterrent because it leverages the entire existing system against the target.
That analogy really does capture the reach. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, the US dollar, well, it underpins so much of global finance. So this isn't just an American law acting in isolation. It has global teeth, precisely because of the dollar's central role in international trade, in banking, and reserves. This makes these sanctions incredibly impactful even thousands of miles outside U.S. borders. It essentially leverages the entire global financial infrastructure to enforce U.S. policy. The power isn't just legal, it's deeply systemic.
Okay, so let's talk about the key players in this specific drama unfolding in Brazil. Who are the main characters we need to understand?
Well, at the very center of it all, you have Alexandre de Moraes. He's a justice on Brazil's Supreme Court, the STF.
And he's the one who was sanctioned under Global Magnitsky.
That's correct. He's the individual designated. This means, as we discussed, U.S. persons are prohibited from transacting with him. Any of his assets that are in or, crucially, pass through U.S. jurisdiction are supposed to be blocked.
So on a practical level, what does that even mean for him?
Well, it can impact things like his ability to use certain payment cards, maybe even international ones or other financial services if they ultimately rely on U.S. companies or networks. It can make even seemingly simple day-to-day financial activities complicated if there's any U.S. connection lurking in the background.
Okay. And then there's Brazil's president, Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. What's his role?
Right, so Lula. He has publicly condemned the U.S. actions. He was quite vocal about the visa revocations that were part of some related U.S. moves against figures linked to Moraes. And now he's the one navigating the complex fallout of this whole situation. Interestingly, while he has activated Brazil's new reciprocity mechanisms, basically, tools that allow Brazil to retaliate in kind, he's also signaled a preference for negotiation over immediate retaliation, particularly when it comes to the broader tariffs the U.S. imposed.
So a balancing act.
A very precarious one. This whole situation really highlights that classic dilemma for a national leader. How do you balance national pride, this strong defense of sovereignty, with the hard, pragmatic economic realities facing your country? It's a very, very tricky tightrope to walk.
Now, you can't really understand this without talking about the former president, Jair Bolsonaro, can you? His history with Moraes seems crucial.
Absolutely central. Some of Justice Moraes' most controversial judicial moves, the ones that really put him in the spotlight, involved cases directly related to Bolsonaro, especially during and after his presidency. This whole history made Moraes a lightning rod in U.S. political debate, particularly among certain conservative circles who were sympathetic to Bolsonaro.
So that domestic Brazilian political fight spilled over.
Massively. That context, that history, it truly helped propel these sanctions against Moraes into a much larger U.S.-Brazil confrontation. It transformed what might have been seen as a targeted human rights action into a much broader, much more sensitive diplomatic flashpoint.
And then there's the U.S. side. Specifically, Donald Trump, the president, at the time the sanctions and tariffs were escalated.
Yes. He added another significant layer here, escalating things beyond just the Magnitsky designation against Moraes. He also imposed these broad 50% tariffs on a whole range of Brazilian goods.
50%? That's huge.
It's massive. And the White House explicitly framed this as a direct response to Brazil's policies and actions. They mentioned things affecting U.S. persons online, which relates to Moraes' actions, and the ongoing prosecution of Bolsonaro. So the implications suddenly ballooned way beyond an individual sanction. What we're seeing here is a clear shift. It went from a very specific legal tool, Magnitsky, aimed at an individual, to a much broader economic pressure campaign, intertwining human rights or rule of law concerns with direct trade policy. That creates a much, much larger challenge for Brazil to handle.
Okay, so the U.S. acts. What was the immediate reaction from Brazil's institutions? You mentioned it was strong.
It was immediate and unified, a display of institutional defiance. Justice Alexandre de Moraes himself came out and declared that the Supreme Federal Court, the STF, would simply ignore the sanctions. He said he would continue his work completely unimpeded.
Wow. Just ignore them.
That was the message. And Justice Gilmar Mendes, another influential STF justice, went even further. He stated unequivocally that the STF would not be intimidated by U.S. threats and that the independence of the Brazilian judiciary was absolutely non-negotiable. Strong words.
So the court digging its heels in.
Completely. It really amounted to a full institutional blindagem, like putting up a shield around Moraes.
Yeah.
You had Luis Barroso, the president of the STF at the time, declaring the court would stand firm. Flavio Dino, who was the Minister of Justice, also offered total support. The STF even issued a formal institutional note defending Moraes. And it wasn't just the court and the Justice Ministry. Even the Prosecutor General of the Republic, Paulo Gone, and the Attorney General of the Union, Jorge Macias, publicly came out in his defense.
So a united front from the legal and judicial establishment.
Pretty much. And this creates that critical point of friction we talked about. An explicit public refusal by Brazilian institutions to recognize U.S. authority domestically. This sets the stage for potential conflict and creates a very, very complicated situation for anyone operating between both legal systems like those banks we mentioned.
Right, which brings us to a crucial question, a knowledge gap maybe, for you, the listener. Given this strong institutional defiance, this official declaration that Brazil won't recognize Magnitsky within its territory, how exactly do private Brazilian banks and companies navigate this? They're deeply embedded in the global financial system. They rely on U.S. dollar transactions. How do they handle this impossible situation without risking severe U.S. penalties themselves?
It's a huge dilemma, isn't it?
Yeah.
Caught between a rock and a hard place, #Tech2.
Yeah.
Notable cases, precedents of defiance. And, Brazil isn't the first nation to find itself in this kind of standoff with the U.S. over sanctions, or to consider a path of direct defiance.
There are precedents.
Oh, yes. History, if we look closely, offers some really stark lessons about what tends to happen next. The U.S. has developed, over time, what you could almost call a destruction protocol, like a second line of attack, created specifically for what they view as rebel countries that choose defiance over compliance.
A destruction protocol. That sounds intense.
It is. Let's maybe look at some of those precedents and see what they reveal. It's quite sobering.
Okay, where do we start?
Well, let's look at the Russia case in 2022. Remember that. Despite years of trying to sanction-proof its economy, Russia experienced a really rapid, devastating impact from U.S. and allied sanctions after the invasion of Ukraine.
I remember it was fast.
Incredibly fast. Within just 72 hours, the U.S. rolled out severe measures. They sanctioned key Russian banks, effectively cutting them off. They pushed to disconnect Russia from SWIFT, that global financial messaging system we hear about. And maybe most shockingly, they froze around $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held abroad.
$300 billion. Just frozen.
Just like that, locked up. The impact was immediate and profound. The ruble devalued by 50% in a single week. Inflation surged by 20%. And the country's GDP contracted by about 8% in just the first year.
Wow.
And what's truly insightful here, I think, is that Russia had prepared. They'd spent something like 15 years building alternative payment systems, accumulating gold reserves, trying to insulate themselves. Yet the sheer interconnectedness of the global financial system and the U.S.'s central role within it proved just too powerful. Russia's economy, despite all that effort, was practically devastated.
Okay, so Russia's one example. What about others?
Let's look at Iran, maybe between 2010 and 2018. Iran really tried hard to resist the nuclear-related sanctions. They attempted to create alternative banking systems, they engaged in bartering trading oil for goods directly, and they even explored launching their own digital currency to try and bypass traditional financial channels. Quite innovative, in a way.
Did it work?
Not really, no. The U.S. response was to unleash massive secondary sanctions. This is a crucial concept. It meant that any company anywhere in the world that chose to continue doing business with Iran risked being completely cut off from the U.S. financial system themselves.
So punishing anyone who dealt with Iran.
Exactly, a global threat. The consequences for Iran were severe. Its GDP fell by a staggering 25% in just 5 years. Its currency, the rial, devalued by an unbelievable 90%. Imports plummeted by 80%. The country was pushed to the brink of social collapse.
So they had to back down.
Ultimately, yes, Iran had to capitulate and negotiate the nuclear agreement, the JCPOA. Although it's worth noting, many U.S. sanctions, even now, continue to persist. It's a clear lesson in the immense, sustained pressure the U.S. can exert through economic means, especially using those secondary sanctions.
Okay, what about Venezuela? I remember hearing a lot about sanctions there. Their situation seems particularly dire.
It is. And the Venezuela case is striking because they tried a different approach initially. They attempted to protect specific sanctioned officials by routing funds and operations through private banks within Venezuela and using state-owned companies, trying to create this sort of shielded financial ecosystem within their own borders.
Trying to work around the sanctions domestically.
Kind of, yeah. But the U.S. simply escalated, gradually but relentlessly tightening the screws. They started with sanctions on individual officials like President Maduro himself, then his ministers. Then they moved on to PDVSA, the state oil company, which is the absolute lifeblood of the Venezuelan economy.
Taking out the economic engine.
Precisely. After PDVSA, the central bank was hit. And eventually, the entire Venezuelan economy became the target of broad, crippling sanctions. The impact. Catastrophic doesn't even begin to cover it. Venezuelan GDP fell by 75% in 8 years. Hyperinflation completely destroyed the currency. And a staggering 7 million Venezuelans, that's a quarter of the entire population, were forced to leave the country.
7 million people.
It's a humanitarian crisis. Venezuela today is often described as an economic corpse, producing maybe only 10% of its former oil capacity. It's a horrifying example of a slow, agonizing economic death orchestrated through sustained, escalating financial pressure.
This is grim. Is there any case where defiance worked, even partially?
Well, you could look at North Korea. It represents a kind of eternal isolation. They developed arguably one of the most sophisticated parallel financial systems out there, trying to operate completely outside the mainstream. They used banks in places like Macau, set up elaborate networks of shell companies in Hong Kong, and even employed state-sponsored cyber hackers to illegally obtain funds, a highly complex, illicit operation.
So they managed to beat the system.
Not really beat it, no. Despite all that sophistication, the U.S. response was incredibly simple but devastatingly effective. They issued a blanket declaration. Basically, any bank, anywhere that touches North Korean money will be banned from the American system, period.
A total lockdown.
Total lockdown. The outcome has been complete financial isolation for over 20 years. Its economy is in a permanent state of collapse, only managing to survive partly due to secret, illicit support from China, which acts as a kind of lifeline. The lesson is stark. Even the most sophisticated evasion tactics struggle against that kind of absolute prohibition when the U.S. decides to fully commit to financial isolation.
So looking at all these cases, Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, what's the overarching message? What's the key takeaway from these precedents?
The key lesson, I think, regardless of the different strategies each country tried building alternatives, resisting, evading is pretty stark. If the U.S. government makes a political decision to financially break a country, it ultimately has the power and the tools to do so. It's a sobering testament to the immense leverage the U.S. holds within the current global financial system.
And what does that mean for Brazil, specifically?
Well, this raises a really important question for Brazil, doesn't it? The global financial system, as we said, it's like this giant spider web, and the U.S. sits right there at the center. Any vibration, any tremor is felt almost instantly. Any suspicious movement, any attempt to bypass the rules is almost immediately detected and often attacked.
And Brazil's position in that web.
Given Brazil's deeply integrated economy, its reliance on foreign trade, on dollar transactions, on international finance, it is particularly vulnerable. I would argue perhaps even more vulnerable than Iran or Venezuela or even Russia were in their respective situations, just because of how deeply embedded it is in the Western-led system.
It's like that analogy you used earlier, keeping your savings in the neighbor's safe.
Exactly. It's like keeping 75% of your national savings, your reserves, in your neighbor's safe, the U.S. and European banks, and suddenly they decide to lock it and say, hold on, we need to investigate where you got this money. You can't touch it for potentially years, and your own financial stability is immediately compromised, maybe even shattered. That's the kind of vulnerability we're talking about. #Tag3 current practices. Brazil's immediate reality.
Okay, so those precedents paint a pretty bleak picture of defiance. But let's get back to Brazil right now. Clarifying the current situation seems really important, especially with all the rumors flying around online. Has any Brazilian bank actually been sanctioned yet?
That's a crucial point, and the answer as of now is no. Despite a lot of speculation and, frankly, some fear-mongering online, no Brazilian bank has been officially sanctioned by the U.S. in relation to this specific issue.
So the rumors about Banco do Brasil, for instance, were false.
Correct. There were claims circulating that Banco do Brasil, the state-controlled bank, was in the U.S. crosshairs. But the bank itself publicly pushed back against those rumors. They put out statements declaring they were prepared to handle complex, sensitive global regulatory issues, essentially signaling they are aware and compliant.
Okay, so no bank sanctions yet.
Right. The reality today is that the specific U.S. designation is on Justice Moraes, the individual, not on any bank directly. However, and this is a big however, Every single bank operating in Brazil, whether it's public like Banco do Brasil or private like Itaú or Bradesco, still has a critical responsibility now.
Which is?
They absolutely must evaluate all their touch points, any connection they might have with Justice Moraes. They need to ensure they are not inadvertently providing services that could create exposure for them under U.S. sanctions law. This means internal audits, heightened due diligence, careful checks on any transaction potentially linked to him. The pressure is definitely on them.
Okay, so let's break this down for our listeners. Beyond the headlines, beyond the official statements from the STF, what are the actual practical boots-on-the-ground changes for Brazil right now? How does this play out in daily operations for businesses, banks, maybe even for Moraes himself?
Well, the primary impact day to day is significant compliance pressure. Any Brazilian institution, and this is broad, that has any kind of U.S. nexus.
Well, it counts as a U.S. nexus.
Oh, lots of things. Processing payments in U.S. dollars, having U.S. correspondent banking relationships, having U.S. investors or shareholders, using U.S. technology platforms or cloud services like AWS, if they have any of that, which includes practically all major banks and many large companies.
Right.
They must now ensure they do not provide any services whatsoever to the sanctioned person, Justice Moraes. This isn't really a choice for them if they want to maintain their access to the vital U.S. financial system. The risk of being cut off themselves is simply too high to ignore.
And that can affect really basic things, right? Like, could his credit card stop working even in Brazil?
Potentially, yes. His access to payment cards or other payment services could indeed be cut off even while he is physically in Brazil, if those services ultimately depend on U.S. companies or U.S.-controlled networks like Visa or MasterCard for processing or settlement. So even within Brazilian borders, the reach of these sanctions can be deeply felt, affecting what seem like entirely domestic transactions if there's a U.S. link somewhere in the chain.
Fascinating.
And complicated.
Very. And this situation creates what you might call legal friction at home. You got the Brazilian authorities, like the STF, publicly saying foreign sanctions don't automatically apply domestically within Brazil. That's the official line. But here's that tightrope the Brazilian banks have to walk. To protect their absolutely essential access to the U.S. system, their dollar clearing, their correspondent banking relationships, their ability to finance international trade, they must respect U.S. rules wherever the U.S. reasonably claims jurisdiction.
So they quietly comply anyway.
Often, yes. This typically leads to a scenario of fragmented compliance. Banks and multinational corporations operating in Brazil will quietly align with U.S. rules on anything that could potentially touch the U.S. financial system or U.S. persons, even if it seems to contradict the strong domestic political statements. Why? Because protecting their vital pipelines to global finance is paramount. They prioritize that global access over domestic political rhetoric almost every time. It's a pragmatic choice.
And what's really striking, as you mentioned earlier, is how this whole situation is broadened out. It's not just about Moraes and Magnitsky anymore. The U.S. also hit Brazil with those huge 50% tariffs. That fundamentally changes the game, doesn't it?
Completely. The move from a single-person designation under Magnitsky, which is at its core a compliance problem for financial institutions, to imposing these broad countrywide tariffs, that transforms the entire dispute. It becomes a much larger macro-level policy confrontation. Now, it's a full-blown fight involving both targeted sanctions and sweeping trade measures, two different weapons being deployed simultaneously.
Okay, let's dig into those tariffs then. What are the likely economic impacts for Brazil? That 50% rate sounds crippling for affected sectors.
It is. The tariff rate became effective in early August, and while, yes, some key categories like aircraft and certain industrial inputs were thankfully excluded, it still hits a really meaningful share of Brazil's exports to the U.S. Many important sectors were not spared, creating a significant new economic burden practically overnight.
Can you give some examples? Which sectors are feeling the heat?
Sure. Let's take beef and agriculture. These are huge exports for Brazil. Higher U.S. tariffs will almost certainly force Brazilian exporters to redirect shipments toward other global markets, likely having to offer discounts to find buyers quickly. Meanwhile, U.S. buyers will naturally start looking for alternatives, maybe from Mexico or Australia, to avoid the higher costs. It disrupts established trade flows.
What about things like coffee? Brazil's famous for coffee.
Right. For coffee and other consumer goods, the tariffs add significant cost pressure for anything entering the U.S. market. So again, Brazil will be pushed to seek alternative buyers, maybe in Europe or Asia. And you can expect to see price ripples eventually show up in U.S. retail, in your coffee shop maybe, and in the food service sectors as costs increase.
And metals, commodities.
For metals and other commodities, it's a bit mixed. As we said, some big-ticket items might have been spared in the initial list, but for those that were hit, you're likely to see both profit margins and export volumes compress significantly, at least until trade flows can eventually be reshuffled and new, hopefully stable markets secured. But that's not a simple or quick adjustment. It requires deep, sometimes painful, market restructuring.
And have the financial markets reacted to all this?
Oh, definitely. Even just the threats of tariffs, before they were fully implemented, already made waves. We saw volatility in the Brazilian equity markets, significant fluctuations in the real's exchange rate against the dollar, an increase in the perceived risk, the risk premia associated with investing in Brazil, and specific downdrafts in the stocks of Brazilian companies known to be heavily exposed to U.S. trade. This kind of uncertainty is poison for investors. It really hampers long-term planning and investment decisions.
So even without direct bank sanctions, the costs are piling up.
Absolutely. That raises a really important question for the Brazilian economy. Even with no bank specifically sanctioned yet, the indirect costs are already substantial. Think about the resources being spent right now. Brazilian financial institutions, major corporations, they're dedicating huge amounts of management time and legal budget just to navigate this. They're repapering contracts, they're tweaking their know your customer KYC procedures, they're refining their internal control systems, they might even be rerouting payment flows.
All just to stay safe.
All just to remain safe from any potential U.S. exposure, to avoid accidentally tripping a wire. And that's a massive drain on resources and efficiency that could be used for productive investment instead.
And if these tensions continue, what are the potential spillovers?
Well, if things don't de-escalate, you can expect a few things. And we might see formal consultations at the World Trade Organization, WTO. Brazil might ramp up its own reciprocity measures, targeting specific U.S. sectors in retaliation. And corporations, both Brazilian and multinational, might start seriously reconsidering and potentially shifting their global supply chains to reduce their exposure to this conflict. All of this just adds layers of cost, increases complexity, and inevitably slows down crucial business decisions across the board.
Okay, this brings us to another knowledge gap, perhaps. Considering this fragmented compliance scenario you described, where banks are caught between domestic politics and U.S. rules, how might Brazilian financial institutions explicitly communicate their compliance strategies? How do they tell the world, we're following U.S. rules to protect ourselves, while maybe trying to navigate the political sensitivities at home? And what long-term impact could this tightrope walk have on Brazil's actual financial sovereignty?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? How do you maintain the appearance of national control when your operational reality is dictated by external forces? It really challenges the very definition of financial sovereignty in today's interconnected world. #tag4, future implications, the defiance protocol.
Okay, so we've looked at the precedents, we've looked at the current situation, the tariffs. Let's think about the future. What if Brazil does choose a path of more overt defiance? What does non-compliance actually mean in practice, and what could happen next?
Right. So what does non-compliance really mean? As you said, it's not quite as straightforward as just saying we won't comply. There are different levels, different flavors of non-compliance, and each one carries vastly different risks and potential consequences.
Okay, what's the most dangerous version?
The most risky scenario, by far, is what we could call institutional non-compliance. This is where a major Brazilian bank, or maybe a large state-owned company, knowingly and significantly facilitates transactions for a sanctioned person, in this case, Moraes, and there's a clear U.S. nexus involved.
Like using U.S. dollars.
Exactly. Using U.S. dollars, or maybe relying on U.S. tech platforms, or dealing directly with U.S. counterparties in the transaction. If a Brazilian institution does that, clearly flouting the U.S. rules, well, they face severe, potentially immediate risks.
Such as?
First, the almost certain loss of their correspondent banking relationships and their ability to clear U.S. dollars. Their U.S. banking partners would likely cut ties very, very quickly to de-risk themselves. That's step one, and it's crippling for international business.
Okay, what else?
Second, there's the very real risk of that institution being designated itself under U.S. sanctions for providing material support to a sanctioned person. Getting put on the U.S. sanctions list, that's a death sentence for a global bank. While it might be a high legal bar to meet, the risk becomes very direct if the facilitation is clear and demonstrable.
And third?
Third, they would face immense reputational damage and funding stress. Global partners, investors, other banks, They would likely pull back rapidly to avoid any secondary exposure, any contamination from dealing with a sanctioned entity. It could trigger a run on the bank, potentially.
Okay, so that's the high-risk scenario. What's the alternative form of noncompliance?
The other form is more like political or legal defiance without actual transactions. This is where you see strong official statements from the government, from the courts, asserting that U.S. measures don't apply within Brazil's territory, like we saw from the STF initially.
Instead of actually do anything practical.
Well, those statements might resonate domestically. They serve a political purpose, rallying support, asserting sovereignty, but those operational choke points we talked about, they still exist.
The dollar payments to tech platforms.
Exactly. USD payments, reliance on U.S. tech infrastructure, cross-border deals. These realities still force private actors, the banks, the multinational companies, to comply operationally wherever a clear U.S. hook exists. They have to survive. So the result is that fragmented compliance we discussed earlier. Banks and big companies just quietly align with U.S. rules on anything touching the U.S. system, regardless of the defiant political rhetoric. It's a quiet, pragmatic form of compliance, driven by self-preservation, showcasing where the real power often lies in controlling the infrastructure.
Okay, but what if defiance does escalate? What if Brazil, or maybe a major institution, really tries to push back? Beyond just statements, you mentioned a destruction protocol. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah. Right. If defiance escalates beyond just words, that there's actual significant noncompliance, the U.S. has developed this machine of financial war that seems to operate almost automatically once triggered. It's not necessarily requiring new big political decisions at each step. The mechanisms are kind of preset, and we're talking about a multi-front attack designed to exert maximum overwhelming pressure.
Okay, walk us through the steps. What's the first front?
The first likely step is sectoral sanctions against the banking system. Basically, the U.S. creates a secondary blacklist. If specific Brazilian banks are found to be knowingly flouting the Magnitsky sanctions against Moraes, they get added to this list.
And what happens to a blacklisted bank?
A sanctioned bank, let's say hypothetically Banco do Brasil, immediately loses its ability to do correspondent banking with any U.S. bank. It can't process dollar payments effectively. It can't participate in foreign trade financing that involves dollars. It's cut off from the main artery of global finance.
When does it stop there?
No, that's where the contagion rule kicks in. Any other Brazilian bank that continues to do significant business with the sanctioned bank also becomes suspect. They risk being sanctioned themselves. It's like a disease designed to spread rapidly through the entire banking system, isolating it piece by piece.
How fast could this happen?
Based on precedents, it can be incredibly fast.
Yeah.
Day 1, the first bank is sanctioned. Day 3, U.S. correspondent banks might start cutting ties proactively. Day 7, international payment systems could block transactions involving that bank. Day 15, European banks often follow suit to avoid risk. Within maybe 30 days, you could see the entire Brazilian banking system facing near complete isolation from the global dollar system. It's a clinical, rapid sequence.
Wow. Okay, that's the banking system. What's next in this protocol?
The second wave is potentially even more devastating in the modern era. A digital blackout, a technology wave.
A digital blackout. What does that mean?
Think about Brazil's deep, almost invisible reliance on U.S. technology. It's pervasive. Major U.S. tech companies like Amazon Web Services, AWS, host a huge percentage, maybe 60% or more, of the critical digital infrastructure for Brazilian banks. Microsoft provides the Windows Server operating systems they run on. Oracle supplies the databases where customer data is stored. Cisco provides the network equipment. VMware provides the virtualization software. It's all interconnected.
So what happens if Brazil defies sanctions?
Well, when a country or its key institutions are marked as non-compliant with U.S. sanctions, these giant U.S. tech companies, they panic. Their absolute #1 priority is protecting their access to the massive, far more lucrative American market. Amazon, for example, gets maybe 70% of its revenue from the U.S. They simply won't risk losing that for the sake of keeping a few Brazilian banks online if those banks are deemed toxic by the U.S. government.
So they'd cut Brazil off.
The scenario could be devastatingly quick. Week 1. AWS might announce a compliance review and give Brazilian banks maybe 30 days to migrate all their servers off AWS platforms, an almost impossible task on that timeline. Week 2. Microsoft could cancel critical Windows Server licenses. Oracle might block essential security updates for databases. Cisco could stop providing technical support for network gear. Week 3, Google might block access to payment APIs used by fintechs. Apple could remove Brazilian banking apps from the App Store. Maybe Samsung Pay stops working.
It sounds like a total system collapse.
That's exactly what it could lead to. Week 4 could see the collapse of the core tech infrastructure for many Brazilian banks. Pix, Brazil's hugely popular instant payment system, could stop functioning if its underlying infrastructure is affected. Credit cards, most of which rely on U.S. networks like Visa and MasterCard, could fail en masse. Internet banking could go offline. It's literally like someone finding the main switch and simultaneously turning off the electricity for the entire national financial system's digital backbone. It could revert parts of the economy back decades overnight, making modern commerce almost impossible.
That's terrifying. Okay, banking system, digital blackout.
Yeah.
What's the third weapon?
The third is perhaps less dramatic sounding, but incredibly powerful: the sequestration of international reserves.
We touched on this. Brazil holds a lot of reserves abroad, right?
Exactly. Brazil holds around $370 billion in international reserves, which is a healthy amount. But here's the critical vulnerability. Roughly $280 billion of that, about 75% of the total, is held in U.S. and European banks, or invested in U.S. Treasury bonds, assets held directly or indirectly within the reach of U.S. authorities.
So the U.S. could just take some?
Not exactly take them permanently, but freeze them indefinitely. It's like that analogy, keeping your savings and the neighbors safe. The U.S. Treasury Department could simply open an administrative investigation alleging suspicion that these reserve funds could potentially be used, directly or indirectly, to facilitate violations of the Magnitsky sanctions or other related measures.
And during this investigation?
During this investigation, which could plausibly drag on for years with legal challenges and bureaucratic delays, those $280 billion in reserves would be totally frozen, locked up. Brazil wouldn't be able to access them, couldn't sell its U.S. Treasury bonds easily, couldn't move the deposits. The immediate impact: Brazil would lose a huge chunk of its capacity to defend its currency, the real, from speculative attacks and to stabilize its economy during a crisis. It removes a fundamental pillar of the country's financial security.
Okay, step 4 in the protocol.
Step 4 is the one often called the nuclear option of international finance: disconnection from SWIFT.
Right, the global messaging system for banks.
Yeah.
But isn't SWIFT based in Belgium? How can the U.S. control it?
Technically, yes, it's Belgian-based, a cooperative owned by banks worldwide. But in reality, it's heavily influenced by the U.S. government due to the dollar's dominance and the U.S.'s geopolitical weight. The process of cutting a country off usually happens in phases.
What are the phases?
Phase 1 is often a warning shot. SWIFT might announce it's conducting a formal review of Brazilian banks' participation due to sanctions compliance concerns. Just that announcement alone would cause international banks to voluntarily pull back, reducing transactions with Brazil to minimize their own risk. It's like giving Brazil financial leprosy. Other banks don't want to touch it.
And phase 2?
Phase 2 could involve selective isolation. Maybe Brazilian banks can still use SWIFT, but with severe restrictions imposed. Transactions become much slower, require extra documentation, become far more expensive, and face intense scrutiny. It's like turning all the financial highways connecting Brazil to the world into unpaved, deeply rutted dirt roads. You might eventually get your payment through, but it'll take 3 or 4 times longer, cost significantly more, and might get stuck along the way.
And the final phase?
Phase 3, if Brazil continues to resist or if the U.S. really pushes, is total disconnection. Brazilian banks are simply expelled from the SWIFT network altogether. The impact: Brazil effectively becomes a financial island. It would be almost impossible to receive payments for its exports or pay for crucial imports reliably. International trade would collapse, devastating the entire economy.
This is a cascading disaster. Is there more?
Oh, yes. Weapon number 5 targets the very core of Brazil's export economy, transforming Brazilian commodities into toxic products.
Toxic products, how?
Remember, Brazil exports a massive $280 billion worth of goods each year, and about 65% of that is in commodities: soy, corn, coffee, iron ore, oil. These are the backbone of its export earnings. The U.S. strategy here would be to create a commercial contamination list.
Another list?
Yes. This list would essentially say any company anywhere in the world that continues to buy major Brazilian commodities while Brazil is seen as protecting sanctioned individuals, well, that company could also face U.S. sanctions. Secondary sanctions again, but applied to trade.
So threatening the buyers.
Exactly. And the strategy is pure psychological terror, really effective. They wouldn't even need to sanction hundreds of companies. Just sanctioning 2 or 3 major global trading houses. Imagine, say, American giants like Cargill or Archer Daniels Midland being sanctioned for buying Brazilian soy. That would cause virtually all other international buyers to immediately stop purchasing Brazilian commodities out of sheer fear of being next.
So Brazil wouldn't be able to sell its main exports.
Pretty much. Brazil would become a commercial pariah almost overnight. Unable to sell its soy, its coffee, its iron ore on the global market reliably, the foreign currency earnings would dry up, crippling the economy.
Okay. Is there a sixth weapon? This is getting hard to even imagine.
There is, and it's a less obvious one, but potentially just as crippling. Pressure on international insurers.
Insurance. How does that fit in?
Most people don't realize this, but about 95% of the global insurance market for things like shipping, cargo, aviation, and major industrial risks is dominated by U.S. or European companies. Think Lloyd's of London, AIG, Zurich, Allianz. These companies insure virtually everything that moves in international trade. So every international trade shipment, every container ship carrying Brazilian goods, every cargo plane transporting coffee, even the oil refineries processing imported crude relies absolutely on insurance. If the U.S. government were to subtly or overtly pressure these major international insurers to stop providing coverage for Brazilian cargo, Brazilian ships, Brazilian planes, or even Brazilian industrial facilities, international trade would simply grind to a halt. Because no ship owner will allow their vessel to sail without insurance. No airline will fly cargo without coverage. No bank will finance a trade deal if the underlying goods aren't insured. Brazil would effectively be declared uninsurable. This wouldn't just make trade difficult or expensive, it would physically stop exports and imports. No ship would leave port, no plane would take off with commercial goods. It's another way to completely strangle the country's physical connection to the global economy.
It's like a multi-layered siege. How does the U.S. even track compliance or defiance across all these complex systems?
That's where technology comes in again, but this time for surveillance. The U.S. has developed an incredible capacity to detect attempts to bypass sanctions, often in near real time. It's not like the old days of hiding money in suitcases.
What systems are they using?
They talk about the financial matrix. It sounds like science fiction, but it's essentially an advanced AI system or multiple interconnected systems that monitors trillions of global financial transactions, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
Trillions.
Trillions. Every single international bank transfer generates a wealth of data, maybe up to 200 distinct data points. The origin bank, the destination bank, the value, the currency, the intermediary banks it passes through, the SWIFT codes used, even potentially the geolocation of the devices used to initiate the transfer.
And AI analyzes this.
Yes. Sophisticated AI and machine learning algorithms sift through these vast data sets constantly, looking for suspicious patterns, hidden connections, attempts to layer transactions, or route money through unusual jurisdictions. They claim they can identify potentially problematic transactions within as little as 30 seconds. So if someone tries to transfer money to a sanctioned individual using, say, an obscure intermediary bank in Singapore hoping to hide it, the system is likely to flag it almost instantly.
And it's not just AI.
No, it goes beyond just the automated systems. They've also cultivated, or perhaps mandated, a network of digital informants, cryptocurrency exchanges, fintech companies, international credit card networks. Many of these players are required, under U.S. regulations like the Bank Secrecy Act, to report suspicious transactions that might relate to sanctions evasion.
So it's like every financial move leaves a digital fingerprint.
Exactly.
And there's this global AI super detective constantly scanning for patterns, plus an army of digital informants ready to flag anything that looks remotely suspicious.
Right.
It paints a picture of almost total financial surveillance, leaving very, very little room for error or evasion.
That's the picture the U.S. projects, and it's a powerful deterrent in itself. Now, all these mechanisms, this destruction protocol, they aren't just abstract economic theories or geopolitical chess moves. They have profound, devastating, real-world consequences. And we absolutely have to talk about the human price of defiance. This isn't about numbers on a screen. It's about life and death for ordinary people.
What kind of human price are we talking about?
Well, let's start with the most immediate and horrifying, a potential sanitary catastrophe.
Healthcare.
Yes. Here's a truly shocking statistic. Brazil imports something like 95% of the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the core components needed to make its medicines, and it imports around 80% of its advanced medical equipment.
95% of medicine ingredients.
95%. So if Brazil is cut off from the international financial system, if it can't reliably pay its foreign suppliers, those foreign pharmaceutical labs and medical device manufacturers will simply stop accepting Brazilian payments or letters of credit. They have to protect their own business.
And the result?
The result would be catastrophic shortages of critical medicines. Think insulin for diabetics, chemotherapy drugs for cancer patients, antiretrovirals for HIV patients, psychiatric medications, antibiotics, basic painkillers. All would be affected. It would be like cutting off the oxygen supply to the entire national healthcare system.
And medical equipment?
Same story. Pacemakers for heart patients, defibrillators, dialysis machines for kidney failure, CT scanners, MRI machines, ventilators for ICUs. Imagine hospitals unable to get spare parts for failing respirators because they can't pay the foreign supplier. In a matter of months, this could lead to thousands, maybe tens of thousands, of avoidable deaths. It would be a humanitarian crisis comparable to a war zone unfolding silently in hospitals across the country.
That's horrifying. What else?
Second, you'd likely see the destruction of the food system.
Food. But Brazil's an agricultural superpower, isn't it?
It is, but here's the hidden vulnerability. Brazil imports about 85% of the fertilizers essential for its high-yield agriculture. Without a steady supply of imported fertilizers, Brazilian agricultural productivity could plummet, some estimate, by as much as 60% in a single harvest cycle.
60% drop.
Potentially. The immediate effect. Food prices would skyrocket. Basic staples like rice, beans, meat, milk. They could become completely inaccessible for the poorest segments of the population, leading to widespread hunger and malnutrition.
And the export side.
That gets hit, too. Remember, Brazil exports $80 billion worth of agricultural products annually. If it can't access international finance letters of credit, the trade insurance we talked about, those exports would grind to a halt. The entire agribusiness sector, a huge engine of the Brazilian economy, could collapse. Millions of rural jobs would be lost. Entire towns and regions in the interior that depend almost solely on agriculture would be devastated. It's a recipe for social unrest.
Okay, healthcare, food. What's the third major human impact?
A severe energy crisis. Brazil imports around 70% of the oil it refines into gasoline and diesel, and about 40% of its natural gas.
So heavily reliant on energy imports, too.
Yes. If Brazil can't pay its international energy suppliers due to financial isolation, those imports stop. Refineries would shut down, gas stations would run dry very quickly, halting transportation, including the trucks needed to distribute food and medicine. Thermal power plants, which rely heavily on natural gas, especially during dry seasons, would fail. This would cause widespread electrical instability, blackouts. Industries would be forced to cease production due to a lack of reliable energy. It would be like throwing the country back into the 19th century in terms of energy access, losing decades of development in potentially just a few months.
And what does all this chaos, health crisis, food crisis, energy crisis lead to?
Inevitably, it leads to technological isolation. Think about the digital blackout scenario we discussed with the tech giants pulling out. No Google services reliably, no Microsoft updates, no Amazon Cloud, no Apple App Store access. But it goes deeper. Universities would lose access to international scientific journals and databases. Researchers would be cut off from global collaboration. Medicine would lose access to global treatment protocols and databases. Companies would lose support for critical software. Banks would lose vital security updates, making them vulnerable. Brazil would become academically and technologically isolated, much like North Korea is today. Innovation would wither.
And the human consequence of that?
A mass exodus of the qualified class, faced with collapsing healthcare, food shortages, energy blackouts, and technological backwardness. Any Brazilian with the skills and the financial means would desperately try to emigrate. Doctors, engineers, scientists, programmers, entrepreneurs, academics, the very people needed to rebuild the country would attempt to leave before it's too late, seeking stability and opportunity elsewhere.
A brain drain.
A catastrophic brain drain. Some have called it an intellectual genocide, though that's a strong term. But you could realistically see Brazil losing maybe 30% of its most qualified, most educated population in just a couple of years if things got really bad. Combine that with the other crises, it would decimate the country's future capacity for recovery and development for generations.
There's one more potential impact mentioned in the sources, something about pensions.
Yes, the destruction of the pension system. Many Brazilian pension funds, both public and private, have significant portions of their assets, maybe up to 50% in some cases, invested internationally, often in U.S. or European markets, precisely to diversify risk and seek better returns.
So if Brazil is financially isolated,
those foreign investments could be frozen or become inaccessible, just like the central bank reserves. The value could plummet. Pension funds might find themselves unable to meet their obligations. Retirements could stop being paid or be drastically cut, leaving millions of elderly citizens and their families, who often depend on those payments, in utter despair. It would tear the social fabric apart.
so putting it all together, healthcare collapse, food shortages, energy crisis, tech isolation, brain drain, pension destruction. It leads to a stark choice, doesn't it?
It leads to a truly brutal moral dilemma. The choice becomes, do you protect the perceived independence and authority of one minister of the Supreme Court, however important the principle of judicial independence is? Or do you protect 220 million Brazilians from a potential humanitarian catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale?
Is maintaining national pride, resisting what's perceived by some as American imperialism, truly worth the price of potentially thousands dying from lack of medicine, or crippling the country's ability to feed itself and trade globally, possibly leading to social collapse?
That's the devastating question, isn't it? And the reality, as harsh as it sounds, is that Brazil, like many countries, is brutally dependent on the international system. It currently lacks sufficient domestic production of critical medicines, essential fertilizers, advanced technology. It lacks a truly independent financial system capable of functioning outside the dollar-dominated global network.
So in this specific context, the idea of absolute sovereignty, it becomes almost a luxury.
You could argue that yes. Sovereignty, in this practical operational sense, becomes a luxury that heavily dependent countries perhaps cannot fully afford if the dominant power decides to exert maximum pressure. The real power in the modern world, this situation seems to suggest, isn't just found in formal constitutions or declarations of national sovereignty. It resides, to a huge degree, in the control of the plumbing, the infrastructure of the global financial and technological system. And right now, that control is still very firmly centered in Washington.
Given these profound human and economic costs of defiance, the sheer devastation outlined in that destruction protocol, it really begs the question, doesn't it? What creative, non-confrontational diplomatic or economic strategies could Brazil pursue? How could it assert its legitimate national interests without triggering this catastrophic cascade? That seems like a crucial knowledge gap, a path meeting urgent exploration beyond just defiance or capitulation.
Absolutely. Finding that third way, that nuanced path, is perhaps the most critical challenge facing Brazilian leadership right now.
Okay, so as this situation continues to unfold, what should we and our listeners be watching for? What are the key signals that will tell us where this is headed?
There are a few key indicators. First, keep a very close eye on any licenses or clarifications issued by the U.S. Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC.
Why are those important?
Because they aren't just bureaucratic paperwork. Licenses, either general licenses covering certain types of transactions or specific licenses granted to particular entities, are the U.S.'s way of fine-tuning the pressure. They can create carve-outs to allow certain activities, maybe to protect specific U.S. interests or avoid wider collateral damage to the Brazilian economy or population. The presence or absence and the specific details of any licenses issued will tell us a lot about the U.S.'s strategic intent, whether they're looking to escalate or potentially provide off-ramps.
Okay, licenses from OFAC. What else?
Second, watch closely how Brazil's reciprocity law is actually implemented, if it is. We know Lula activated the mechanism, but the key is how and where Brazil might decide to target U.S. sectors in response. Will it be retaliatory tariffs on specific U.S. goods? Will they target U.S. services? Or maybe even go after intellectual property rights? The nature and scope of Brazil's response will indicate the government's resolve, its strategy, and whether it's primarily seeking leverage for negotiation or genuinely preparing for a trade war.
Makes sense. What about the banks?
Expect bank guidance to emerge relatively quickly, probably directed at their corporate clients and international partners. Major Brazilian banks will likely publish advisories or FAQs explaining how they are interpreting and managing their U.S. exposure in light of the Moraes sanction and the overall tensions. Reading between the lines of this guidance will be a key indicator of how that fragmented compliance is actually being managed at the operational level by the institutions on the front lines.
And the markets.
Absolutely monitor the market impacts. Keep watching the Brazilian real's exchange rate, FX, against the dollar. Look at the global price dynamics for key Brazilian commodities affected by the tariffs, like beef and coffee. And pay attention to any corporate earnings calls or guidance updates from Brazilian companies, especially those heavily reliant on U.S. trade, to see if they're factoring in negative impacts. These are the immediate economic pulse points reflecting the real-time stresses.
Finally, what about legal and diplomatic moves?
Yes, keep an eye on legal appeals and diplomacy. Will the designation of Moraes under Magnitsky be formally challenged either in Brazilian courts or potentially even U.S. courts? Will the tariff executive orders face legal tests in the U.S., perhaps from affected industries? And crucially, are there signs of behind-the-scenes negotiation between Brasilia and Washington aimed at finding a truce or a de-escalation pathway? The diplomatic channels, however strained they might seem, remain absolutely critical avenues for a potential resolution short of triggering the worst-case scenarios. #tag outro.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. What does this all mean for you, our listener?
Yeah.
Our deep dive today, I think, really shows that the initial Magnitsky action against Justice Moraes, while narrowly targeted at first glance, carries real significant teeth because of how deeply it connects into the intricate plumbing of global finance. And then the addition of those sweeping 50% U.S. tariffs clearly escalated this. It turned what started as a targeted human rights or rule of law tool into a much broader macro-level trade fight with far wider implications for the entire Brazilian nation.
And what becomes profoundly clear, I think, from looking at both the current situation and those historical precedents, is that defiance doesn't just magically switch these pressures off. It's not that simple. Instead, choosing defiance often just redirects that intense pressure onto the very institutions and sectors, the banks, the exporters, the tech users that are desperately trying to keep business flowing, trying to function despite the new legal and financial tripwires the sanctions create. The real lesson here, perhaps, isn't just about specific individuals like Moraes or Bolsonaro or specific court decisions. It's about understanding where true power resides in our modern, hyper-interconnected world and how that power, often financial and technological, is actually wielded, sometimes quite ruthlessly.
So as Brazil faces what might be the greatest test of its national sovereignty in recent history, maybe here's a final thought for you to consider. When these kinds of financial and geopolitical empires clash, who ultimately pays the price? It's rarely the decision makers at the very top, is it?
Usually not, no.
And what does this whole episode tell us about the true meaning of independence, of sovereignty, in a world that is so brutally, inescapably interdependent? We really hope this deep dive has given you a clearer picture of the complex dynamics and the incredibly high stakes involved in this Brazil-US standoff. Keep exploring these issues, keep questioning the headlines, and above all, stay well informed. Thanks for joining us.